My name is Elena. I'm 31 years old. I was folding laundry on a Sunday morning when my coworker called me, barely breathing. Elena, she said, your husband is standing outside my apartment right now. He says you're missing, and you haven't answered your phone in hours. I stopped moving. I looked across the hallway into the kitchen. My husband was standing 5 feet away, pouring himself a second cup of coffee, completely at ease, still wearing the gray t-shirt he slept in. I had been with him since we woke up. Before I tell you what I found out next, please like this video, subscribe to Heartstring Stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened after that phone call changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. My husband Connor and I had been married for 4 years. He worked as an IT infrastructure consultant, which meant he traveled constantly. 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there, sometimes a full month overseas setting up systems for corporate clients. It was the nature of his work, and I had accepted it early in our relationship. When he was home, we made it count. Quiet dinners, weekend hikes, lazy Sundays, exactly like the one I was having when everything fell apart. 3 weeks before that phone call, Connor had come home from his longest assignment yet. Nearly 10 weeks in Zurich, helping a financial firm migrate their entire data architecture. I had missed him terribly. When he walked through the door that Thursday evening with his suitcase and that tired but happy smile, I felt everything in me relax. He was back. My husband was finally home. The first week felt normal. Jet lag made him quieter than usual, which made sense. He slept longer, moved a little slower, seemed distracted sometimes mid-conversation. I chalked all of it up to the adjustment of being home after 10 weeks away. I made his favorite meals. We took a long walk through the neighborhood on Saturday. He held my hand the entire time, but small things kept nudging at the edge of my awareness. Not red flags, nothing dramatic. Just tiny moments that felt slightly off, like a painting hung 1 inch too low on a wall. You know something is wrong, but you can't immediately say what. The first moment was maybe 4 days after he came home. I asked him to grab the dog's leash off the hook by the back door. He went to the front door instead. I laughed and pointed him toward the back. He laughed too and said he was still half asleep. I believed him. The second moment was when I made his coffee the way he always took it, 1 sugar, no cream, and he drank it without commenting. Connor had been gently complaining for 3 years that I added too much sugar. He never let it go. It was a running joke between us. That morning he said nothing. Just drank it and thanked me. The third moment was quieter than the others. We were watching television one evening, and I reached over and rested my head on his shoulder the way I always did, and for just a second, maybe 2 seconds. His body went slightly stiff before he relaxed and put his arm around me. It lasted barely a moment. I told myself he was tired. I told myself 10 weeks away from your spouse changes your rhythms. I told myself I was being paranoid because I had missed him so much that now I was searching for problems where there were none. So on that Sunday morning, I was folding laundry. He was in the kitchen. Life felt ordinary. Then my phone rang. It was my coworker, Meg. She and I had worked together for 3 years and lived in the same part of the city, which was why what she said next made my blood go cold. Elena, she said, please don't freak out. But your husband is standing in the hallway outside my apartment. He knocked on my door about 10 minutes ago. He said you've been missing since last night and you're not answering calls. He looked really upset. I almost let him in, but something felt wrong, so I called you first. I stood completely still. I looked down the hallway. Connor was in the kitchen. I could hear the coffee maker. I could hear him opening the refrigerator. Meg, I said slowly. What does he look like? She described him. Brown hair, medium build, around 6 feet. The green jacket Connor wore all the time. Does he have a small scar on his chin? I asked. Connor had gotten that scar mountain biking years before we met. It was faint, but visible up close. Meg paused. Hold on. A few seconds passed. No scar that I can see. I set down the shirt I was folding. I walked into the kitchen. My husband was standing at the counter, scrolling through his phone, coffee mug in hand. He looked up when I came in and smiled. Everything okay? He asked. Fine, I said. Work thing. I smiled back and returned to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment before I called Meg back and told her to ask the man to wait, that I would be there in 20 minutes. Then I sat very still and tried to organize my thoughts because what I was thinking felt impossible. There was a man standing outside my coworker's apartment claiming to be my missing wife's husband, and my husband was drinking coffee in my kitchen. I drove to Meg's building, telling myself there would be a rational explanation. A prank, a misunderstanding. Someone who happened to look like Connor. My mind kept cycling back to that scar. Connor's scar was something almost no one knew about unless they had seen him up close. If the man outside Meg's door did not have that scar, he was not my husband. When I pulled up, I sat in the car for a long moment. Then I went inside. The man standing in Meg's hallway looked exactly like Connor. Same height, same build, same jaw. He was wearing Connor's green jacket. But when I stepped closer and studied his face, something was wrong. This man's chin was smooth. No scar. He looked at me with unmistakable relief. "Elena," he said. "Thank God. Where have you been? I've been calling you since last night. Why aren't you answering your phone? I came home and you weren't there." My throat went dry. His voice was close to Connor's voice, but not exactly right. A little lower. A slightly different rhythm to the words. "Who are you?" I asked. He blinked. "What are you talking about?" "It's me. It's Connor." I took a slow breath. "My husband has a scar on his chin from a mountain biking accident in 2017. "You don't." He touched his chin. A flicker of something crossed his face. So fast, I almost missed it. Then he said, "I had it treated. A dermatologist. A few months ago. I mentioned it to you." He said it calmly and confidently, and for a moment, I doubted myself. Had he mentioned it? Could I have forgotten? 10 weeks is a long time. People change small things about themselves. I told him I was confused and overwhelmed, which was entirely true, and that I needed to go home and clear my head. He asked to come with me. I told him I needed to go alone. The look on his face when I said that was strange. Not hurt, the way Connor would have been. More like calculation. Just for a fraction of a second. I drove home. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was not. When I walked back through the front door, my husband was on the couch watching football. He looked up. "That was fast. Everything sorted out?" "Yeah," I said. "False alarm." He nodded and turned back to the game. I sat beside him and smiled and laughed at the right moments for the next 2 hours, and the entire time my brain was working through something I was almost too afraid to name. Over the following days, I paid attention to everything. Not in an obvious way. I watched and I listened, and I filed things away. His laugh was slightly different. The real Connor laughed with his whole body, shoulders shaking first. This man's laugh started in his face. The real Connor kept his phone charger on the nightstand on his left side. This man charged his on the right. The real Connor always took his shoes off at the door without thinking. This man sometimes forgot, and I would hear his footsteps tracking across the kitchen floor. None of these things were proof of anything. Habits shift. People change. Jet lag and long trips affect routines. I kept reminding myself of that. But I also started sleeping badly. I would wake at 2 in the morning and lie completely still beside this man and stare at the ceiling and think about the man in the green jacket outside Meg's building. The one without the scar. I reached out to him. I had saved the number he called me from that morning outside Meg's building. 3 days after that encounter, I texted it from a number he wouldn't recognize. I wrote that I had found his wallet and asked if he wanted to meet to get it back. He replied within minutes. He said yes. He gave me a coffee shop address for the following afternoon. I told the man at home that I had a work lunch and drove across the city. He was already there when I arrived. Up close in daylight, the resemblance to my husband was precise in a way that made my stomach drop. Cheekbones, nose, the line of his jaw. But the scar was gone. And his eyes, when I looked carefully, were a slightly different shade. Less green, more gray. I sat across from him and asked him directly who he was. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My name is Connor Marsh. I am your husband." His voice was completely steady. "And I think the man in your house is someone you need to be afraid of." The coffee shop noise seemed to disappear. I could hear my own heartbeat. He told me his name was actually Connor, that he and the man living in my house had grown up together, gone to the same college, worked at the same company for 2 years. That his name was Ryan Calloway. That Ryan had been in love with me since Connor and I started dating, had never gotten over it, and had spent the years since our wedding disappearing from Connor's life gradually, cutting contact, and apparently doing something else entirely in the time he was out of sight. He told me that 3 months ago, before he was supposed to return from Zurich, someone had run him off the road on a dark highway outside the city. He had woken up in a private hospital he did not recognize, with a broken arm, 2 broken ribs, and no phone. By the time he was able to reach anyone, weeks had passed. The people caring for him had been told he was a John Doe. His wallet was gone. His phone was gone. Everything that identified him was gone. I sat across from this man and looked at his face. And I thought about the scar, and I thought about the coffee with 1 sugar and no complaint, and I thought about the 2-second stiffness when I put my head on the wrong man's shoulder. I asked him one question only I would know the answer to. The name of the street where Connor and I had our first date. He told me without hesitation. He told me what I had ordered. He told me what song was playing inside the restaurant when we left, and that I had sung along badly the entire drive home. I gripped the edge of the table. He reached across and placed his hand over mine. His hands were Connor's hands, and on his left ring finger was his wedding ring, scratched in the same place as mine was. From 4 years of ordinary daily life, I drove home in a kind of trance. When I walked through the front door, Ryan, the man I now understood I was living with, was in the kitchen again. Always in the kitchen. I wondered if the kitchen felt safer to him, somehow, less intimate than the bedroom or the couch. "How was lunch?" he asked. "Good," I said. Long. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay in the dark and thought very carefully. I did not call the police yet. Not because I was frozen, but because I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. Ryan had been living in my home for 3 weeks. He had access to everything. Our financial accounts, our legal documents, the safe in the closet where Connor and I kept the title to our car, and the deed paperwork for the property we had been saving toward. If I moved too quickly, and he sensed it, I did not know what he would do. I had a plan forming, but it needed time. I called my sister the next morning from my car in the parking lot at work. I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I knew something was wrong. I saw him at your dinner last week, and I couldn't place what it was, but something was wrong." She had not said anything at the time because she thought she was imagining it. She started helping me from that day. She was quieter and more methodical about it than I was, which was exactly what I needed. She started pulling threads I didn't know how to find. Within a week, she had located the private clinic. It was registered under a holding company with no obvious connection to Ryan, but she found it through a chain of financial records that connected back to an account Ryan had used when he and Connor worked together. The clinic specialized in reconstructive surgery and, based on what my sister found in their accessible records, had a history of working with clients seeking dramatic appearance changes. Not the kind of clinic that asked many questions. She sat across from me in her car in a parking garage and showed me what she had found on her laptop. Intake photos. Pre-surgery documentation. A man who looked like Ryan Calloway with a completely different face. And post-surgery records, with timestamps spanning the months before Connor was due home from Zurich. 6 separate procedures. Subtle, careful, cumulative. By the final surgery, the face in the photos was nearly identical to the one my husband had looked at in the mirror for 34 years. I cried in that parking garage. Not loudly, just steadily, the way you cry when something has confirmed a fear you had been carrying for weeks, and the confirmation is both a relief and a devastation at the same time. I thought about every dinner we'd had at that kitchen table. Every night I had lain beside a stranger I believed was my husband. Every moment, I had second-guessed my own instincts because this man had done his research so carefully that my doubts always seemed like my problem. My sister held my hand and let me cry, and then said, "What do we do next?" I wiped my face and thought about it clearly for the first time without panic. "We build the case," I said, "and then we end this." I went home. I smiled. I cooked dinner. I asked about his day and listened to whatever he told me, which was always vague and somehow never quite answerable if I pushed for specifics. Though I had learned to stop pushing in obvious ways. I acted the same way I had every evening for 3 weeks. But every day I was also doing something else. I was photographing documents, forwarding emails to a private account Ryan had no knowledge of, saving bank notifications and cross-referencing them against the timeline my sister had built. Ryan had been subtly working toward gaining access to 2 joint investment accounts Connor and I had, positioning it as estate planning, suggesting we finalize some paperwork now that Connor was home and they were back together. He had been nudging toward it for 2 weeks in casual conversation, mentioning a financial advisor, suggesting they should update their documents. I understood now what that was. He had not only wanted my husband's face and my husband's life. He had wanted the financial foundation underneath it. The real Connor and I met twice more in the following days, always in places Ryan would have no reason to look. Each time felt surreal. I was meeting my husband in secret from the man pretending to be my husband. Connor was steady throughout. Steady in a way that I recognized, because it was the same steadiness I had fallen in love with. He was not reckless, and he was not reactive. He was patient and organized, and he trusted me to handle my end of it. The morning before everything came apart, my sister sent me a final document. She had obtained communication records through a contact she had at a legal research firm. Text messages between Ryan and the surgeon at the clinic, spanning 14 months. In the early messages, Ryan described his plan in a way that left nothing ambiguous. He talked about Connor as an obstacle. He talked about me in a way that made my hands shake to read. He had been watching our life from the outside for years, cataloging details, building toward this with a patience that was more frightening than rage would have been. And near the end of the thread, 2 months before Connor was supposed to return from Zurich, he had written 4 words that removed any remaining doubt about whether the accident had been an accident at all. I printed everything. I organized it in a folder. And I made a phone call. The following day, Ryan came home in the early afternoon to find me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop open. I told him I had heard from the financial advisor and that she had time to meet with us that afternoon to go over the account documentation he had been talking about. He looked genuinely pleased. He got changed, put on the blue shirt he wore when he wanted to seem trustworthy, and walked with me to the car. The address I had given him was a conference room at my sister's law firm, where she worked as a paralegal. When we walked in, 3 people were already seated at the table. My sister, Connor's attorney, who Connor had contacted the previous week, and 2 detectives from the city's financial crimes unit, who my sister had briefed 48 hours earlier with the full documentation package. Ryan sat down. He looked around the room once. He did not sit back in his chair the way an innocent person does. He sat forward slightly, already calculating. I opened my folder and slid copies across the table. Before we talk about any accounts, I said, I'd like to start with these. The photographs from the clinic were on top. Then the communication records. Then the financial trail. Then the timeline my sister had constructed, laid out with dates and places and cross-reference documents, 14 months of planning printed on 8 clean pages. Ryan looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking. The attorney began reading the clinic communication records aloud, slowly and clearly, in the quiet room. Ryan's chair scraped back. He stood up. He started to say something, and then one of the detectives said his name. His real name, Ryan Calloway, and told him he was being detained pending formal charges. And the thing I noticed in that moment was that he did not look at me. Not once. He looked at the documents, and at the detectives, and at the attorney. But he never looked at me. I think he understood that I was the reason none of his preparation had been enough. The charges came quickly, and they came in layers. Identity fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, financial impersonation, aggravated assault for the accident that had nearly killed my husband on a highway outside Zurich 3 months earlier. The accident had been staged with a second vehicle, rented under a false name, connected back to Ryan through a rental agency that kept better records than he had anticipated. He was held without bail pending trial. I did not watch him be taken out of the building. I was already on my phone. I was calling my husband. Connor was waiting outside when we came through the front doors. He was standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the sky, the way he does when he's working through something in his mind. When he heard my footsteps, he turned around and I walked across that sidewalk, and I held on to him for a long time without saying anything at all. His arms felt right. Not warm and familiar and almost right. Actually right. The way something feels when you've been living with a copy for so long that touching the real thing is both a relief and a kind of grief, because now you understand exactly what you lost for those weeks, and you are furious and grateful in the same breath. We stood there on that sidewalk until my sister put her hand on my back and said we should go. The trial was 7 months later. Ryan's attorney attempted several arguments. That the surgery was cosmetic and unrelated to any fraudulent intent. That the accident was unconnected to his actions. That the documentation was circumstantially assembled, none of it held. The clinic communication records alone were enough to establish premeditated intent. The rental vehicle connections sealed the assault charge. His own careful planning, documented in his own words across 14 months of messages, became the most complete case against him imaginable. He was convicted on all counts. The sentence was substantial. The morning after the verdict, Connor made coffee. He made it with 1 sugar and no cream, and when he handed it to me, he said, as he had said 100 times before we were married and 100 times after, "You always put too much sugar in mine." And I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months, because the person standing in my kitchen saying the thing I had heard so many times it had become ordinary was my husband, my actual husband. Not a man who had studied him. Not a man who had memorized the details of his life and worn his face and stood in his kitchen, hoping I would stop noticing the things that were almost, but never exactly right. What I want to tell you, because I think about it often now, is that I came close to convincing myself I was wrong. Every time I doubted him, he did something kind and patient and plausible, and I would feel ashamed of my own suspicion. He was counting on that. He had studied not just my husband's face, but my husband's specific way of making doubt feel like my fault. And the thing that kept me from fully surrendering to that doubt was not some dramatic moment of clarity. It was small. It was a missing scar. It was coffee that went uncommented on. It was 2 seconds of stiffness that lasted no longer than a breath. The smallest things are sometimes the truest ones. And learning to trust them, even when every other voice tells you that you are imagining it, is the hardest and most important thing I have ever done.